Thank you so much for joining us on this July 3rd. I'm Lynette Clemetson, Director of Wallace House and head of the Knight Wallace Fellowships for Journalists and the Livingston Awards here at the University of Michigan. I'm pleased to have so many people joining us today for our inaugural Democracy Cafe, the first event in the University of Michigan's Democracy and Debate theme semester, focusing on free speech and exchange of ideas, what it means to be a responsible member of a democratic society, and democratic engagement from a global perspective. Over the next several months, the university will explore these ideas through courses, online learning opportunities, voter engagement in the Big Ten Voting Challenge, and special events like this Democracy Cafe today. Today's conversation is being streamed live on YouTube, and we want to include your questions. You should see on your screen a Q&A box to submit questions throughout our discussion. We'll be following as you go along, as you add questions, and we will include your questions and comments in the second half of the conversation. This session is closed captioned and it will be recorded for those unable to join us live. So what better way to start a series on the importance of active engagement in the democratic process than with a discussion of the Declaration of Independence, our audacious founding document that was radical and endlessly complicated for its time, and that remains extremely challenging for us to engage with and live up to today. We're thrilled to have with us here Professor Danielle Allen joining us for this very important conversation. Professor Allen is a renowned political theorist. She's director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard, and she's the 2020 recipient of the John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, awarded by the Library of Congress. For the purposes of today, she's here because she happens to be the author of this exquisite book, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality. I have to say that for me, this book has been a special surprise gift in this incredibly difficult year, in what has been in many ways a reductive moment in our society. I have so appreciated this book's call to pull up and to be reminded of the bold ideals set forth in this document, and its call for us, for me, for all of us to feel empowered, to feel impelled, to borrow a word from the framers, impelled to claim and demand and organize for freedom and democracy as our absolute inheritance as Americans. So Danielle, thank you so much for joining us to talk about the Declaration of Independence. It's really great to be able to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you for your first Democracy Cafe. It's a wonderful idea and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So before we jump into talking about the document itself, I think I want to acknowledge that for some people, the Declaration of Independence is a difficult document to even consider engaging with, that the hypocrisy built into the document, that it lays forth ideals that even the authors of the document could not live up to themselves, makes it difficult to even want to consider reading it and engaging with it. So that we can talk about it today, can we just try to crack through that for people?
That's great. No, I'm so glad you started there, Lynette. I do think that's the first question people have. They ask, wasn't it written by Thomas Jefferson? Wasn't he an enslaver? How can I take the document seriously? What about the place of women in the document? What about Native Americans? Those are really critical questions. And so I want to say something about each of those themes. So, and I apologize if this might be a bit of a longer answer than you want, but it's so important. So I think we have to start by recognizing that Thomas Jefferson, when he had inscribed on his tombstone, author, Declaration of Independence, was in fact being self-aggrandizing. Indeed, the document was written by a committee. Jefferson was the scribe, he was the lead drafter, but the intellectual work had been driven over the course of the preceding year by people like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, among others. John Adams never held slaves. Benjamin Franklin had been an enslaver earlier in his life, but became an abolitionist. Both Adams and Franklin in various ways supported abolition. And their work shows up in the document. The phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is actually an anchor for abolitionism. The fact that they didn't put property on that core list, property at that point had already become closely connected to a defense of enslavement. Franklin noted that fact in debates about the Articles of Confederation. So the important point is that there were numerous voices involved in drafting of the Declaration. There were enslavers involved, but there were also actually the voices of people who literally fought enslavement. And indeed, the first political use of the Declaration after independence itself that July was for purposes of abolition. A free African-American named Prince Hall took the text and drew on it in January of 1777 to submit a petition to the Massachusetts Assembly to end enslavement in Massachusetts. And indeed, that had been accomplished in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Vermont by the early 1780s. So that's just one example. There's a lot to be said about the place of women in the relationship to the Declaration. Also, the experience of Native Americans. The experience of Native Americans is in some sense the worst part of our history. Already people were fighting for abolition in that moment that I just mentioned. There were already people fighting to expand opportunities for women. And actually women could vote in the early republic. People don't know this, but in some states women could vote and then lost the right to vote. So by 1806, women no longer had the right to vote. So the story is very complicated. For Native Americans, I think there is very hard to find any moments of redemption in the story of the Declaration. And so we have a lot to grapple with as a country. We have to be honest about the crimes in our shared history. We have to process those crimes together. We have to own them, take responsibility for them. But then we can also recognize the story of empowerment and possibility that is a part of the story of the Declaration as well.
I think also to start engaging with the work, it's important to discuss the timeline and what people see as the founding of our society. The Declaration of Independence, we're talking about the period of years around 1776. But in our popular conversation this year, we've spent a lot of time talking necessarily about the importance of 1619. And how do we square those two different dates and the thoughts about the notions that framed our country?
We've had an amazing debate in the country this year about when we were founded, what counts as a founding. And I think that's been an incredibly productive debate. One of the things I hope it's brought to the surface for people is that we have to recognize that we have both a political constitution and a social constitution. The argument that the country was founded in 1619 is correct in relationship to its social constitution. When enslavement began on these shores, that is the point at which a set of habits of racial domination took root, and they have been woven through the fabric of our social constitution for centuries. We're fighting now to change and renovate that social constitution. The political constitution was founded in 1776, 1787, and 1788 with the Declaration and the Constitution. And it's important that we see the political constitution and the social constitution as separate but interacting things. So at that official founding moment, 1787, 1788, the political constitution and the social constitution came into alignment with each other. The political constitution had the 3/5 compromise in it. It treated Native Americans as adversaries at war to be met only with through treaty or otherwise through warlike forms of engagement. So social and political came together then. And since that moment, we have been working hard with forward movement and backward movement to renovate the political constitution. We renovated it with the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. We renovated it with the grant of citizenship to Native Americans in the early 20th century, with Brown versus Board, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. So our formal political institutions have been transformed from that founding point. The question we face now is, can we also renovate our social constitution and bring political constitution and social constitution into alignment for a truly egalitarian 21st century?
Well, so that's a great segue into jumping into the meat of the text and how people think about the Declaration. One of the things I was struck by immediately in engaging with your work is that in our popular context, we tend to think of the Declaration as an event. It's something that we associate, especially right now, at this time of year, with fireworks, with cookouts, with going to the beach, and things right now that people feel that they can't do, but primarily as an event. And what you're calling us to do is think about the Declaration as an organizing philosophy and a decree or a memo that lays out government's relationship to society and society's relationship to government. So talk about how we wrestle with just how we see the Declaration.
Thanks a lot. No, I appreciate that. So there are two important things I think I want to say about the Declaration as a moment of philosophical coalescence or kind of catalytic moment. So folks often don't give the Declaration enough philosophical credit, but it does actually represent a philosophical innovation, a moment of originality. And the specific element of originality in the Declaration is the fact that it attributes to every individual human being the capacity to make their own judgments about the pursuit of happiness, what will count as happiness for them. And then it puts on all of us individually the job of figuring out how to bring our individual or personal happiness into alignment with something that the Declaration calls the safety and happiness of the whole people. So philosophers have for a while been arguing that government should help cultivate or inspire happiness for the people. They have been arguing for a while that government should secure rights. What the Declaration does is really say every single human being has the capacity to participate in this activity of making judgments about happiness. We have been trying to draw out that philosophy ever since to understand what does it really mean to organize a society rooted in that recognition of fundamental human equality. So that's the first important thing to say about the Declaration. But the second thing is that it actually takes really hard work in our political institutions, in our organizations, to figure out what it actually means to run decision-making based on that egalitarian idea. What does it actually mean to have power sharing in our organizations, even in universities, at all of our different layers of decision-making? And as the folks at the period of the Revolution were trying to figure out what to build in the wake of Britain, they were really continuously wrestling with these questions, both about fundamental philosophy and about how we organize political and social institutions. And so that's why it's not just a sort of one-day event. What happened on July 4th was that they agreed on a framework. They agreed on this commitment to the notion of individual capacity. They agreed to a notion where you sort of work out organizations to achieve power sharing. They failed insofar as they did not make that project inclusive at that first moment. And so now the job falls to us to take those powerful, important moments of creation and add to them a third discovery about the value of truly universal inclusion.
One of the things that just from before you even crack a page in this book, the title, A Reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality, gives us an indication of what you're wanting us to wrestle with, right? Because in our contemporary context, when we focus on the Declaration to the extent that people have even read it or considered it, we most often think about liberty and how different people read liberty. And we've come to think of it largely as individual liberty and happiness. What makes us happy and free as individuals. And then when you dig into the document, it's clear that that's not really what is being argued. And actually it's a collective plea to be called to a higher purpose, to organize as states, to organize as a society, and to do political organizing. But we don't almost never discuss it that way.
No, you've got it exactly right. I mean, so at the point that they were working out the core ideas of constitutional democracy, it was very common for people to refer to the goal as building a society for free and equal self-governing citizens. And again, we understand the limitations of that. They were not inclusive in their definition of that society of free and equal self-governing citizens. We can take that and turn it into an inclusive picture. But it was that concept of free and equal going together, sort of hand in glove, that they were trying to get their heads around. And so what does that mean exactly? So in order to be free, we need to not be dominated by others. We need to not be subject to sort of arbitrary power or decision-making. Consequently, freedom depends on our having equal standing as decision makers. So in order for any individual person to be free and for all of us to be free, we have to be protected from domination from one another, but that also means we actually have to have a role in shaping collective decisions. We have to have a role in political decision-making. We have to have a role in organizational decision-making. So equality comes into the picture as a necessary foundation for freedom, insofar as it's what people need to be authors of their communities, authors of collective decisions. So that's a long answer. What I'm sort of getting to the point of it all is that freedom depends on power sharing, on equal political standing, where political is understood to mean both our political institutions on the big picture, but also inside of organizations, inside of institutions. So I think that's what we're working on right now, is how to actually achieve power sharing across all sectors of our society in our many different kinds of organizational homes.
And there's a certain romance even that you bring to this notion of democratic process, right? The notion of people coming together, feeling impelled by events to try to stand against tyranny. And that the writing of the document itself and the words chosen represent this collective enterprise, right? That it wasn't, as you said in the beginning, Thomas Jefferson writing some words and people putting their signature at the bottom, that it actually was, for anyone who's a writer looking at the pages of edits, it's both comforting because you realize everyone gets edited, and it's also extremely frustrating because you can see what was cut out. And democratic process, which you uphold as an ideal, I wondered and I struggled with why we should celebrate that, right? Because sometimes democratic process results in concessions that are actually extremely costly. One of the things that stands out in the book is that Thomas Jefferson wrote a whole section of the Declaration that really indicated the degree to which he was struggling with slavery, and it was completely edited out of the document. One of the things that the document in its first iteration had a very light reference to God, and by the time it got to the final version, there was a sort of more heavy-handed religious implication that was written into the words, and that came through committee. And so how do we wrestle with this part of the democratic process that can actually make things worse?
So you've asked several important questions, and I want to be able to respond to all of them. So I'm just going to say what I heard them as being and then respond. So you asked a beautiful question about democratic process and how it actually works with all these committees and words, and why do we think it matters to put all that much time into our careful statement of words, statements of purpose, and so forth. And then you also asked a question about compromise and the danger of compromise. How do we tell the difference between good and bad compromise? Does using democratic process necessarily require compromise? And if so, how do we get our heads around that? So I'm going to start with the second question and come back to the first question. So yes, the Declaration reflects compromises, and you've pointed to the two main ones, a compromise around enslavement and a compromise around religion. I actually find this quite useful because in my view, the compromise around enslavement is a bad compromise, and the compromise around religion was a good compromise. And if we can call out the differences between them, we actually learn something about compromise. That's important because at the end of the day, yes, you can't have a functioning democracy without compromise. People, in order to maintain political institutions run by the people, we have to make preserving them our first goal, actually. And sometimes that means losing out on a policy question in a policy domain and accepting that loss and making a compromise in order to preserve the process that gives us control over our lives in the first place. That's a kind of complicated thing to accept. But so then it's so important to know the difference between how we get a good compromise versus how we get a bad compromise. So the compromise around religion, I think, was ultimately a good one. When you read the Declaration, there are a few things that stand out. First, the justifications for the fundamental ideas are given two bases. There is a religious or theological, better to say, sort of justification, in the sense there's the language of we are all created equal, endowed by a creator. At the same time, there's a language that draws on nature. So it's the laws of nature or nature's God that you can take as the justification for the arguments. So You don't actually have to believe in God to accept the arguments of the Declaration. You have to, have some recognition of a kind of universal human nature, and therefore have a kind of a picture that takes a justification from the concept of nature. But you don't need a theological basis to do that. So there's a kind of belt and suspenders approach to justification and a big tent approach to justification. And then the second important feature of the language that does invoke the notion of a creator of some kind, or divine providence, or the supreme judge, is that none of those formulations were specific to a specific church or doctrine at all. So it didn't matter what religious affiliation you had, those terms were things you could connect to. So that compromise succeeded insofar as it included the perspectives of everybody who was at that time resident in the colonies. It included the perspectives of deists, of atheists, of practitioners, of faithful of a variety of different kinds of faiths. In other words, it was inclusive. The compromise rested on full inclusion. Now, let's look at the enslavement compromise. Okay, you know where I'm going already. The enslavement compromise in the Declaration is that the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was an anti-enslavement moment by blocking the concept of property out there. But then there was the passage that did attribute sacred rights of life and liberty to Africans that was deleted by Congress. And that was a pro-enslavement moment in that compromise. Now, when that compromise was struck, there's no sense in which it rested on an inclusive foundation. It was not the case that all affected by the compromise were included in making it. African Americans who were enslaved were not included in the creation of that compromise. And from my point of view, that's how we can take a lesson about how to make good versus bad compromises. A good compromise is one that pulls the voices of all affected by the decision into the conversation. And only once all voices are present and wrestling together do you begin to even figure out what the space of possible compromise is. If you can do that, achieve full inclusion, all voices of all affected, then I think you have a ground for using compromise as a tool of democratic decision-making. Okay, now, that was a lot, but it brings us to a really important point about democratic process, all right, and how our job is different from the job of 1776. And this gets to be very, very specific, some things I've learned. So democratic process is about articulating common purpose and then building at least sort of ideally supermajority of kind of consent behind that common purpose, and not just a bare majority, but a supermajority. And then figuring out how to implement from that common purpose to a set of concrete actions. All right, now to build common purpose, you've got to start with the first questions. How do we define a healthy social compact anyway? What are our goals here? You have to have that value statement, that statement of mission at the start of a process, and agree on that. And then you can start to pull out the concrete solutions that you need. But something I've learned over the last few years running commissions of a variety of different kinds is that we do now have to always have bigger groups at the table than people are historically used to having. People used to think they could run a commission or a decision-making body with 15 people or 20 people. I don't think you can do that anymore with fewer than 40 people, literally. And the reason for that is to get all those voices in the room, to capture the full diversity of experience of any given community. And running a meeting for 40 people is really different than running a meeting for 20 people. So we literally have to develop new kinds of process skills in order to use the instrumentation of democracy for purposes of full inclusion and to results that rest on a foundation of full inclusion.
So you're now moving us forward to consider how we apply this document today.
Yes.
And when I was reading it, I was constantly pulled into the events of this spring and summer, that there seemed to be a great currency in the arguments and in the very language that was being used. And again, this notion of individual versus collective, I think that comes up over and over again. I'll start first with our situation with the pandemic and how we might think of applying this, because in your work at the Safra Center for Ethics, you have been working on COVID and how we apply ethical democratic principles and engagement to addressing this pandemic. In one of the parts of the book, you talk about John Adams and an early text that he wrote that informed the writing of the Declaration. And I was really struck by a part of his treatise, which was called Thoughts on Government, I believe, very straightforward title. And he talks about the happiness of the individual being the end of man. And that the purpose of government is the happiness of society, and that reasonable people should understand this. And when I read this, I couldn't help but think about the debate that is going on now about wearing masks. And every day, looking at the news and seeing at least one person a day making the argument that they need not wear masks. They can't be forced to wear a mask because it is their individual right as an American not to wear one. And it just has been running through my head as I engage with these texts. So how do we jump in a current context?
So thank you for that question. And the issue of mask wearing, I think, really brings out a core part of the Declaration's argument that many people are missing. And I want to just articulate that and then try to say something about how it might help us think about our response to COVID. So this is the all-important second sentence. I'm just going to go ahead and recite it because I think it's really important for people to have it in their minds. And just, I want people, as I recite it, to listen for the word happiness. I want people just to register where it comes up, okay? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. But among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So I cued everybody. So you should have heard happiness comes up in the beginning, and it's an individual happiness. But then it comes up again in the end, and it's a collective happiness, their safety and happiness, right? The job of democracy and of being part of a society of free and equal self-governing citizens is for us to figure out how to activate the pursuit of individual happiness, but in a way that delivers our safety and happiness together. So none of us actually has a right to sort of pull out of a social compact where the goal is to deliver safety and happiness for all of us. So this brings me back to masking. That is, the issue with the pandemic is that it's a collective problem. It is about our social connection to each other. So there is literally no such thing as an individual action in relationship to the pandemic that doesn't have consequences for other people. It's not possible for us to be in a bubble of one in relationship to the pandemic. So every decision about whether to wear a mask or not is actually a decision about our collective safety and happiness. And it's just an illusion if people want to try to describe that action as being purely about their own individual happiness. So I think masking sort of really brings out the way in which we have been sort of too, I'm not sure what the right word is, we've failed to help really draw out the connection between the individual pursuit of happiness and our shared responsibility to a social compact whose goal is the safety and happiness of all. Our individual happiness has to contribute to that bigger picture in order for us to be pursuing it in appropriate ways. So I do think that with COVID, what we've seen is sort of this discovery that the basic concept of what our social compact is about has fallen away, has eroded. We've lost sight of it. I was very shocked in the beginning of the epidemic with how quickly people moved into this sort of conversation about, well, maybe we should just abandon the elderly. Basically, maybe we should not worry about whether or not, how much time do they have left? We heard that kind of thing being said. That's a horrifying concept. Again, if you just look at the language of the Declaration, the point is the job of building political institutions is that we use them together to deliver our safety and happiness, everybody's safety and happiness. The social compact starts from the proposition that we don't abandon anybody in a moment of crisis. We start by figuring out how to deliver safety and happiness for all. So I do think we have a lot of work to do to help people see how their individual pursuit of happiness has to be connected to a commitment to a shared safety and happiness. That's moral work, that's cultural work that we need to dig in and do together to restore the resources of solidarity on which a healthy democracy depends.
And you, in reciting that sentence, which you spend the better part of 100 pages, on this sentence, these are really chunky sentences. These first two. The second part of that sentence seems to call into mind the other thing we're going through now, right? This moment of collective call for change.
Absolutely.
That when people feel that a government is not moving forward in their best interest, and in fact is in some ways imposing a tyranny on them, that it is the right of people.
Exactly.
And the responsibility of people to act, which is the other thing we're going through now. So can you help us then go back into the text and break down that?
Absolutely. I mean, you put your finger on it, right? I mean, so that second sentence names the purpose of government is to secure the rights of the people. And so whenever a government is not securing the rights, it's the job of the people, the right of the people, to alter it, to lay a foundation on principle and organize the powers of government in a form that will deliver on securing those rights. So it's not accidental that we see a tight connection between current protests and direct actions and demonstrations against police brutality and the revolution of the Declaration. The colonists themselves were very much responsive to arbitrary police power. So in the 1760s, for example, the British had produced something called the writs of assistance, which gave customs officers the authority to search without cause, and sort of like stop and frisk of the day. And throughout the 1760s and 1770s, the colonists were experiencing arbitrary police power and really complaining against it, constantly petitioning Britain for changes, constantly petitioning for redress of grievances, and then, as they say, being met by repeated injury. And I think that the work that people have been doing for a long time now, I mean, certainly since 2014 and the deaths of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown on police reform, has a similar pattern. People have been looking for redress of grievances and yet have been met by repeated injury. And so in that regard, face the moment of recognition that it's time for a very substantial alteration of our institutions in order to establish them on a foundation of justice.
And in fact, people, I think there's a temptation to read the activities of this spring and summer as spontaneous.
Right.
But you make the point that the colonists, in fact, just didn't wake up one day and decide on a revolution, that there was a course of events that they had been documenting and living through and suffering through that led to the action. And even though the action itself was revolutionary, it was building upon documentation of grievances.
That's right, exactly. And I mean, they were very self-conscious about that, right? So they say that government should not be changed for light and transient causes. So they felt a strong obligation to really try repeatedly through the existing channels of alteration to achieve the redress of grievances that they needed. And I think we've watched the same thing happen after the Ferguson events. The Department of Justice put a big report out about Ferguson, and there were reforms in Ferguson. So people have been working really hard consistently through a lot of channels in order to achieve redress of grievances. But instead of getting that, what we've seen actually is that policing practices have continued even to evolve in more problematic ways in the last few years. I mean, the sort of return of military grade equipment and so forth to the police after an effort to take that away from policing was a reversal. It was a moving in a backwards direction. So people have been working very hard. There, as you know, has been lots of grassroots organizing. And I think it's important to say that, as again, in the language of the Declaration, the work has had two prongs. There's work on values, and then there's work on thinking through new policies and institutions. So, right, the Declaration says, to alter government, you got two jobs. You've got to lay the foundation on principles, and you have to organize the powers of government to deliver safety and happiness. So the vocabulary of Black Lives Matter, that is pushing us to revisit our principles, is pushing us to get to a place where we recognize that we've actually succeeded at having all lives matter by virtue of making sure that those who have been least well off are absolutely given full and equal status, that their dignity is protected and assured. And that is a really important body of work on our values that's been done. And now that is being connected to the work on the organizational side as people look at the question of how do we rethink community municipal budgets, for example? How do we rethink community safety and public safety as we try to pursue healthy communities for all members of our society?
I really appreciate your focus on seeing this empowerment and inclusion in the document, because I do think in a moment where we're focusing so much on systemic inequality, it can be tempting to want to push away official documents with the expectation that they simply don't include everyone. And so therefore, why consider them? And you're flipping that on its head and actually putting forth a challenge to people to engage and actually look carefully at the words and make the document your own and insert yourself into the collective process. And if you haven't been included in the committee, insist that you are included in the committee. And that's a pretty bold challenge.
No, that's exactly right. You've got it. It is an empowerment challenge. The Declaration of Independence is a recipe for empowerment. It was used as a recipe book for empowerment, and it can be used as a recipe book for empowerment. The people who first used it didn't do everything right, and they committed crimes in various ways. But that doesn't actually change the fact that it is a successful recipe book for empowerment. And again, that recipe book has those parts of lay the foundation on principle, do that work on values, change public opinion, get out there and help people see what the morally correct direction is. And also figure out how to organize the powers of government, make sure our institutions function to deliver safety and happiness for all. And in order to do that, you've got to vote. Voting is not the end all and be all, but it is a necessary piece. Necessary, but not sufficient. But if we're not voting, then we're not using one of the primary tools of alteration available to us. So got to get out there and vote, and then figure out what are the other lever points, the other levers to pull in our institutional system to organize the powers of government to deliver safety and happiness for all.
I want to get ready to go to questions. I know we've had some coming in. And if you haven't submitted a question yet, please do so. We'd like to include them. Before I go to the first question from our audience, I want to ask you to go to the beginning of the book, because the book is not just you breaking down the document for people. It also serves in some ways as part memoir of your own journey with the Declaration. And you start the book by talking about your teaching the Declaration to students, to two different groups of students. One, a group of students in a more traditional college setting, and another teaching the Declaration to students who were in night school, pursuing an education while they were working full time and raising families and trying to move up in society. So can you talk a little bit about what you learned from that process?
It was a terrific experience. I sort of always think of it as my teaching with my day students and teaching with my night students. And there were different communities, all wonderful. And it was interesting to me that my night students, who came from all different kinds of walks of life, all stories of struggle, they were trying to change their lives, connected to the Declaration of Independence much more powerfully and quickly than my day students. So my day students would sort of tend to get lost in lots of academic questions about the Declaration, exactly what happened when and the historical events and that sort of thing. But my night students went to the core. They read the text and they saw a group of people diagnosing the course of events, documenting and diagnosing the course of events, declaring what the problems were with the world they found themselves in, and then finding a pathway to a solution, a specific change in their political organizations, but also a solution that depended on mutual commitment of people to each other, depended on solidarity. And so my night students got that immediately. This was a story of people changing their lives, changing their world. And so for me, that really opened up the Declaration. It showed me how it really is a manual or a recipe book for empowerment. And that's the message. It's the message my students gave me that I've been trying to share ever since.
There's a question here that I'm going to try to summarize. It says, thank you for this book, which echoes my own romance with this document. I desperately want to claim as my own. Is there a tension between how you use language as a tool of empowerment and voice, or maybe representation and visibility, especially for those marked by race and gender and legacies of silence and absence and non-representation? And you do focus a lot in the book on language. And what's the difference between language and voice?
So I think they're very closely connected to each other. And I see the Declaration as an invitation to voice. I think we sometimes forget to say out loud that the people who have done the most to transform our society have not been citizens. We forget that, right? But all those folks who fought to end enslavement, people like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, they did that without being citizens, right? So in other words, we don't need a formal permission to add our voices to the conversation. The Declaration shows us how language can craft common purpose for a society, and we all have a voice we can use to contribute to that story, contribute to that narrative. So in the first instance, I think, we use our voices to stand up and be counted. We use our voices to shape common understanding and common purpose. And we use our voices to transform our institutions and organizations so that then, in terms of their formal permissions too, they are inviting everybody in.
There's a question that follows from that, Danielle. How should we read the position that the Declaration has about the naturalization of foreigners in a moment when there's so much official rejection and opposition to immigration?
So the Declaration put a high value on immigration. The founders recognized that the strength of their new nation depended on recruiting human talent and depended on recruiting people who would be committed to the community of free and equal self-governing citizens they were building. I'm lucky I recently got to chair a commission for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences on the practice of democratic citizenship. And we did listening conversations all over the country to hear about what people feel are the obstacles to participation and how might we redress those. And I had this incredibly powerful conversation with a group of Cambodian refugees, now citizens in Lowell, Massachusetts. So they came to this country decades ago, fleeing from the violence of the Khmer Rouge. And I have never heard such a powerful account of the value of constitutional democracy as they offered. They also expressed frustration. They have trouble connecting with elected officials, trouble participating to the full extent of what they aspire to and had expected. But they understand the value of freedom and equality and the kinds of protections that our institutions provide. And I do think that if we look at the history of the country, the story of immigration has over and over again restored the sources of understanding of the value of freedom and equality. So in that regard, I hope that we can do a better job as we move into the future of drawing on the Declaration to embrace immigration as a positive value for our society.
I guess that would also require people who do consider themselves empowered and already included to bring into, in this enlarging of committees of action that you talk about, people who
Yes.
are outside.
Exactly. Absolutely.
So there's another question here about institutions of government. It says another key issue is access to money and economic resources of society. Many often state that we're one of the wealthiest nations, yet also one of the most unequal. Any suggestions for bringing collective voice to economic equality when assets are often held by individuals and corporations?
I do think there's a lot we can do there as well. And I do think we can bring more democratic governance into corporations. I think Germany provides some really interesting examples of structures where employees participate in governance structures of corporations. So I think that's a model we can build on and should build on. I also think that there are when we focus on the sort of economic structure of our country, we tend to focus in the first instance on questions of distribution. I think it's time for us to sort of shift our focus and focus on production instead. And there's some terrific work by the economists Danny Roderick and Chuck Sable that lay out the way in which we could use various kinds of community level, municipal level, coordinated decision making to rethink production structures, to rethink which industries were developing in which places, how to make those work for communities as well as for the corporations developing them. So I would refer you to the work of Danny Roderick and Chuck Sable.
I want to ask a question about organization and audacity. You know, when you think about some of the language in organizing the United States, the argument that somehow the states and the colonists could see themselves as equal to England and Great Britain, the king, that was a pretty bold claim. And you work through how that might have been set forth as an argument. And it struck me as important to try to not just read through, but to try to absorb, because right now we're having a lot of conversation in society about the legitimacy of organizations and who has a voice and how people claim and gain power and how they see, is it equal power, or is it equal stature, or is it simply an equal right to power and stature?
So I think that's a great question, and I think you're pointing to our need to have a clearer understanding of the different components of equality. So, you know, I think there is political equality, which is about access to institutions, access to conversations with decision makers, for example. There's a sort of whole lots of kinds of access questions. There's also social equality, which is about, you know, when we're in a meeting, can we all look each other in the eye? Are there some people who are expected to defer to others? Do some people take up more airtime than others? And in regard to social equality, we have a lot of work to do to generate habits and practices of what I like to call political friendship, so that we can truly be equals in making decisions together. And then, yes, I mean, there's also what I call power sharing, which is about making sure that it's that sort of project of inclusion that I was describing, so that when you're building an organization and the organization is driving a set of decisions, are you thinking about all who are affected by those decisions? And are you ensuring that the voices representing the different constituencies affected have all been pulled into the decision-making process? And that's a kind of power sharing component, which is also a part of equality. So I think we need all of those things. We need political equality in the sense of access to formal organizations or formal points of decision-making and so forth. We need social equality, those practices of political friendship. And then we also need that power sharing that comes from inclusion of the voices of all affected in decision-making.
You're anticipating some of the questions coming in. There's an interesting question here. It says, I wonder if you might say more about the mismatch between our social constitution and our political or written constitution. How might we bring society's understanding of the Constitution in alignment with the written text?
Okay, now that's a great question. So we spend a lot of time talking about how we fall short of our ideals, and I'm actually trying to say something slightly different. So I want to clarify what I'm trying to say. So we have these ideals that are stated, say, in the Declaration or in the preamble of the Constitution. And they are that foundation of principle that the Declaration says that we need. And then there's the question of how we organize the powers of government. Okay, that's concrete and it's institutional, it's operational, et cetera. And so what I'm suggesting is that that question of how we organize the powers of government is actually a broader issue of how we organize the powers of government and society. And so we have our ideals, equality and freedom, for example, justice, liberty and justice for all. That's at the sort of top. And then we have a way that we set up institutions and organizations. That's our political constitution. And then there's a way that we set up our private society organizations and our practices of interaction with each other. And that's our social constitution. And our political constitution is the one captured literally by the written constitution literally by the amendments, literally by the Supreme Court decisions and so forth. And we've gotten pretty good at knowing how to alter and amend that over time. And if you just look at our formal institutions on paper, we look great. We look like an incredibly inclusive and egalitarian society. All right, so you think, well, what's going wrong? You think, oh, what's going wrong is over here in our social constitution. It's in how we organize our private organizations and our habits for interacting with each other. And it's that social constitution that really does need thought. We've been doing it. Colleges and universities, for example, have been doing a ton of work on issues like diversity and inclusion and belonging for a long time. That's a part of it. It absolutely is. And that's being extended. Sort of the Me Too movement has extended that work as we sort of think about what does it mean to share power genuinely inside organizations. And now as we look at the sort of issue of policing and questions of racial domination, we're looking more broadly at our cultural habits about, again, who is afraid of the police, who's not afraid of the police, why, where does that come from? How do we change those basic habits and expectations? So the cultural work and organizational work is work for all of us. I think sometimes we think that this work of renovation and transformation sort of belongs with elected leaders or public officials. But the hard thing we're facing right now is like we've hit the point in the progress of our nation. And this is kind of a beautiful thing. We've hit the point where the job is now for all of the rest of us to transform the social constitution, to get it to catch up with the kinds of renovations we've achieved in our formal political constitution.
And it's this next question, it follows from that, but it sort of gets to this question about, okay, yes, you can complain about the king and the fact that he's a tyrant, but also ultimately you have to do something about it.
Exactly.
If you want to change that tyranny. And so someone asks, America seems to be so divided now. How can an American citizen make this declaration their own at a local level? What kind of democratic processes and discussions do we need to create at a local level to get a sense of inaction?
Well, I want to actually make a very specific recommendation here. I mentioned this commission I had the great privilege of co-chairing from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We released a report a couple of weeks ago called Our Common Purpose. And if you just Google Our Common Purpose, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, you'll find it. And we've got 31 concrete recommendations, but more importantly, we've identified a huge network of organizations that are champions for these recommendations. And so we are inviting people to explore those champions, find an organization that you might want to get involved with or support. And that's a way that you can advance the conversation about democracy already today. Another thing that you can do is just download our report. We, in the report, lay out a lot of the kinds of arguments I've been making today about the work we need to do to reinvent democracy for the 21st century. Gather a group of friends and neighbors and just have a book group. Go ahead and read it together. And consider for yourselves what immediate local actions might you be able to take to help your local government become more responsive to its constituency, to help your local government empower its constituents more effectively. My belief is that if you put your imagination to that question, you will find solutions.
This last question is a pretty weighty one. Has the Constitution lived up to and exceeded the promise of the Declaration, or has it fallen short? And if so, why?
So that is a weighty question, and I wish I could give a simple answer to that. So the thing to do, so the Declaration is the statement of principle, and the Constitution is how we organize the powers of government. It's the literal instruction manual for organizing the powers of government. And its initial drafting, that what we ratified in the beginning, fell short of the ideals of the Declaration. And so as we have sought to renovate the Constitution over time, we have constantly been bringing it closer into to the ideals of the Declaration. However, the ideals of the Declaration were themselves incomplete. The ideals of the Declaration did not formally include full inclusion. It left open the possibility of full inclusion, but it has become necessary to name full inclusion as one of the core principles. So we do care about securing rights We care about that for all, and we include everybody in that political work that we do together, right? Now we, in that regard, have renovated our ideals at the same time that we've renovated the Constitution, okay? So in that regard, I think the ideal is still beyond us to some extent. We are still inventors. It is still on us to experiment our way to the right articulation of a goal of liberty and justice for all, resting on a constitutional democracy of free and equal self-governing citizens. All right, so we're still refining that articulation of our ideal. And it's still very much on us to continue to renovate both the political constitution and the social constitution to deliver on that ideal. So I guess I'm saying, let's not worry so much about whether the Constitution and the Declaration line up. Let's reframe the question as one about what's our contemporary articulation of our ideal, learning from both documents, and what work of renovation do we see before us for our generations.
And to learn from both documents as we prepare to close, we have to read the document.
Yes.
And you make the point that, and most people would agree, most people, adults, if they have ever read the Declaration of Independence, haven't read it in a long time. It's
Yes.
actually a relatively brief document. It's 1,337 words, if I remember you writing. And reading it, I think if you engaged with it as a child for a test, coming back to it as an adult in this moment is a pretty glorious act, that you can read into it what you know about how we have to move through society. And so I know that you can recite it, even if we just do the first two sentences. Can I read the first sentence and you pick it up and,
Sure.
and read the second sentence, which will go through the one sentence that most people know. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish them and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Those are two masterful sentences. And
they are, yeah, they really are.
And a call to action if ever there was one.
Yes, and they are a call to action.
And so Danielle, I want to thank you for providing us all with an entry point into this call to action. And I know everybody is watching Hamilton today. We are too at my house, but I also want to encourage you to, if you don't have this book, to buy it. Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality. I guarantee you that it will give you an accessible entry point into claiming your empowerment for our democracy. And we have a lot of students who have joined us here today. I do want to remind everyone that we want to encourage University of Michigan students to submit your own reading of the Declaration of Independence, either in its entirety or a section that really speaks to you. The first 25 students to record themselves and upload it and get it to us will receive a signed copy of Danielle's book. And you can read more about this and submit your videos at the link that should be being shared in the Q&A right now. You can also visit publicengagement.umich.edu for more information. Danielle, I could keep talking to you about this book for hours, but we have to let people get to their day. And I hope that as people move through this July 4th weekend, that rather than focusing on the gatherings that we can't have, that we should focus on the rights that we do have, and what we're being called to do in this moment of great power. And Danielle, I'll leave the last word for you.
Well, first, Lynette, let me just say thank you. This has been a real pleasure. And I so admire the conversation that you and your colleagues at the University of Michigan are sponsoring and engaging your students in. This is a transformational moment in our country, I believe. It is a moment for rediscovering common purpose. It is a moment, I believe, for redefining our social compact so that we can indeed motivate ourselves to mutual commitment to one another and to the ongoing health of American constitutional democracy. I'm so glad you guys are working on that. It's such a beautiful thing to see happening. Thank you, Lynette.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank all of you. Enjoy your Independence Day weekend.
Happy 4th.
Happy 4th.